So good afternoon everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is the last in our series where we will be exploring mental health. I'd also like to take the opportunity to say a big thank you to Parabola for their support in helping deliver this series to our members. If you've missed any of the previous sessions as well, they are available on the Edinburgh Chamber of Commerce YouTube channel, along with all the other events that we've hosted digitally so far. For those of you that haven't met me before, my name's Rebecca and I'm part of the events team at the Chamber. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Stuart Cameron from Health in Mind, who's going to take today's session as we look at habit and habit formation. The session of today, the format, we will be doing the Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, if you either pop them in the chat function or raise your hand and we'll come to you at the end. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to Stuart to take us all through today's session.
Awesome, thanks Rebecca. I'll just try and share my screen with people and see if this works okay. Is that all right? Can everyone see that okay?
Yep, perfect.
Yeah. So, as Rebecca just mentioned, this is the third we had done. The first one we had done was on just looking at different models for wellness, and then my colleague Hayley did one on sort of supporting other people with their mental health. So for anyone who doesn't know, my name is Stuart Cameron. I am a support and development worker at Health in Mind. I put on a series of courses that look at just different ways that people can sort of better maintain their mental and emotional well-being. And so if anyone's sort of interested in finding out any more about that, please feel free to sort of contact me. So today we're going to look at habits and habit formation. And first, I guess we'll take a look at why habits and what does that have to do with their mental health. We'll talk a little bit just about what is a habit, you know, what actually is the definition, I suppose, of a habit. We'll look at what I call the anatomy of a habit, so what makes up a habit, and then how we can use this information to our own benefit and to sort of influence our habits. And just last, we'll look a little bit at how that information is sort of used by marketing, etc. And then, as Rebecca said, we'll finish up with a Q&A. But please feel free to sort of jump in or ask any questions sort of throughout. I'm happy for people to kind of interrupt in that sense. By the way, sometimes I've been having sort of technical issues sometimes with my microphone. It just suddenly switches to a kind of dialect style voice. If that happens, please do let me know. So first we'll look at why habits. And as human beings, we're sort of we're a real sort of bundle of habits. We rely on them a lot throughout our sort of lives. And it's incredibly useful to us to form habits. And I'll go into a bit more detail on that later. But from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed, we engage in hundreds and hundreds of habits. Without ever really noticing it as well. And since, I guess, the start of lockdown, many of us have been forced to sort of change their habits, and sort of the things that we typically rely on to structure our days and to give us a sense of predictability are almost entirely gone, or we're having to develop, or are still developing new ones right now. And so that's everything from our work-related habits, where we go to work and who we spend our time with at work, to our exercise habits, our eating habits, all our hobbies, the ways that we socialize, for instance. All of these things have sort of been turned inside out. And one of the other reasons that we're going to talk a bit about habits is because probably, and I'm sure there'll be people here who've either had this themselves or have someone that they know has said it, but things like, oh, now that we're on lockdown, I'm going to use this time to start a new habit, whether it's yoga or whether it's reading more, or maybe people wanted to drink a bit less or to eat healthily, work in the garden more. So people had all this kind of desire to develop new habits that they feel personally is going to sort of improve their quality of life. And one last sort of reasons that I think it's important to talk about it is because in times of sort of high anxiety or heightened uncertainty, we have a tendency to revert to sort of habits that are sort of well worn, you know, that are very much ingrained in our sort of daily life. And sometimes this can be good, sometimes it can be bad, but it sort of will just provide a bit of context maybe as to why that is. So it'll be really useful for yourselves, I think, if you just take a moment to sort of bring to mind some particular habits that you've got. And you know, we could, it might be that there's some habits you've got that you dislike or that you want to change, or you thought of, oh, you know, I'd like to stop doing this during lockdown. Maybe some habits that you'd like to develop, or perhaps even just have a think about habits of someone that maybe you're close to or that you live with that you dislike. So just bring to mind some kind of habits that you've got. And so we'll look at what is a habit. So a habit is anything that we do repeatedly and often unconsciously. So for example, you know, all the things that we regularly do first thing in the morning, whether that's taking a shower, making a cup of tea, making toast, waking up the kids, whatever it is, we often do these things without necessarily having to think much about them. And the more we do a habit, the more sort of automatic we become in how we do it. And this is kind of, it's two sides of the same coin. This is kind of the saving grace of habits, but it's also their sort of downfall. I'll use the example here of learning how to drive, because it's quite relatable for a lot of people. But the first time you ever sort of sit in a car with your driving instructor, it's an incredibly overwhelming experience, because you need to think of all these things that you've got to do. You need to coordinate your body and lift the clutch, and you know, you need to be checking the gears and checking your mirrors and directing the car. And it's just, the whole thing is an incredibly mentally draining experience. You know, it just requires so much mental energy. But fast forward, you know, however long, maybe a few years later, most of us now can get into a car, drive to work, during rush hour traffic, navigate roundabouts and traffic lights and cyclists, and, you know, all the while listening to the radio, or, you know, drinking a cup of coffee, or shaving, as I've once seen. So all of these things, you know, we manage to do all these things without even really noticing that we're ever driving. You know, it just becomes so automatic. And as I said, this is the sort of good thing about habits, is it frees up our mind to do other things. We don't need to sort of engage in this thought process every time we do things. But it's also if we're referring to sort of habits that we don't like so much, that can be that can make them difficult to change. And just on that point, throughout this talk, I will try and refer to habits as either being helpful or unhelpful, rather than as good or bad. You know, we often hear that's a good habit or a bad habit, but quite often, you know, a lot of the habits that we develop, we've developed in a particular context and for a very good reason, and at that time they are helpful. But oftentimes, when we are in a different situation, they become a bit less helpful. And to give another example of that, someone who was in one of my courses learned to drive in France. And then when they started driving in the UK, they said they would try and change the gears with the wrong hand at the wrong side. So this is a habit that we've got that's useful in one context, but not so useful in another. And I guess likewise, if anyone's tried to drive in a foreign country, you might find that things always feel a bit complex to begin with. And just for the purposes of I guess for simplicity's sake, I'll talk particularly about sort of behavioural habits throughout this chat. But you may also consider sort of how this applies to different habits that you've got in your life, whether that's thinking habits or whether it's communication habits. You know, do you have a tendency to communicate in particular ways, or to sort of snap at people, or to, you know, to be dismissive, or whatever it might be. And then it also applies on a sort of wider scale. So organizational habits might apply to the workplace or to a family or whatever. And then on an even bigger scale, societal habits, which is certainly a big one right now in terms of we're really sort of renegotiating the ways in which we interact as a society. You know, even just on the street, when you pass someone by, when you're in a shop, these things are all sort of in flux at the moment. So I said that we would talk a little bit about the anatomy of a habit. So what is it that actually makes up a habit? Why do we do these things repeatedly? And there's these four sections to it. So the first one that I've got there is a cue, and this is the thing that actually reminds you to do the habit. You know, what is it that tells you, that puts the idea in your brain to make a cup of tea or to do any of the things that you do. So there's the reminder, and this can be a physical object. So again, just going with the tea theme, that might be that you see the kettle or you see the mug. It might be an emotion, so maybe you're feeling stressed, or you know, maybe you're anxious. It could be a place. So for instance, whenever you go into your kitchen, or maybe it's when you arrive at work, you get this reminder to do it. It might be at a specific time. So for instance, morning being a perfect example of that. An activity that you're already doing. So for instance, if you're making breakfast, for instance, it might be that you automatically pop the kettle on. Or it can be another person, you know, so someone coming round, or just a person that serves as a reminder there. So that's the first part. The second part of it is this craving, this sort of desire, the kind of driving force behind what we're hoping to get out of doing that habit. The third part is the response. So that's actually the habit itself, the routine that we go through. And then the fourth part is the reward. And this is the benefit of doing the habit, but particularly the sort of neurochemical component of that. So these the reward systems that in our brain that sort of say that was a good thing or not. And that's obviously, that part of it in a sense is largely, we're not conscious of that process. So I'm just going to give some examples here of habits that you may have at some point engaged in your life. So I call this one the snooze button. You wake up in the morning because your alarm's going off. You feel really sleepy. You're sort of craving silence because you want that kind of annoying alarm to just stop. And you're also sort of craving more sleep. So what do? You roll over, you pick up your phone, you hit snooze, and you fall back to sleep. And then, of course, the reward is that you get more rest, and you get some peace. I'm going to assume that that's familiar with most people. I think everyone has done this at some point in their life, if not daily. So the next one, brushing your teeth. So the cue, it might be that you have finished your breakfast, or you finished your morning coffee. You've got a sort of gritty film in your teeth, or maybe you just feel like you've got sort of morning breath. And we have this craving for clean teeth and for fresh breath. So we go to the bathroom, we brush our teeth, maybe you floss, maybe you use mouthwash, whatever routine it is that you go through. And then the reward, of course, is that we feel clean, we feel comfortable, we feel confident in our interactions with other people. We're not sort of trying to hide our mouths because we're worried that we've got coffee breath. Phone notifications, another one. So we get this cue, or phone buzzes, or it beeps. We immediately get this craving to check our phone. And this is a fun one, is to, can be more or less strong in people depending, but for some people, particularly if you look at teenagers when their phone buzzes, you know, if they're not allowed to sort of check their phone, it can become a real source of irritation for them. So it's interesting to observe that. So we get the notification, we want to check it, we pick up our phone, we read the notification, maybe we respond to it, and there's that reward. We get this distraction, we get maybe a sense of entertainment, perhaps we get a sense of connection with other people if it's someone who's been in touch with you that you sort of crave connection from, in a sense. And social media, so maybe the cue is that you sit down and you're waiting, you're feeling bored, perhaps you're on the bus, or perhaps it's the waiting room at the doctor's. You're craving something to do, some entertainment. The response, of course, is that you take your phone out your bag or your pocket, you open up a social media app and you just sort of start scrolling. And there, of course, the reward is that you get that sense of entertainment, and you get that your time is occupied effectively. And so, I mean, this happens just even on scales that that are so minute. You know, for instance, when you walk into a dark room in the evening where there's no light, you will immediately sort of have this desire to see, you know, to be able to see. And so you'll shoot your arm out and you will turn on a light, and you know, there's your reward. You can now see. And it's interesting because we don't do this. You know, we don't have a habit of turning on lights during the day when we can see everything perfectly. It's only when we don't see. And it happens so subconsciously that we don't even notice that we're doing it. So I'd like people to just kind of take a moment now to think of how that process maybe works for some of the habits that you had brought to mind earlier on. What is it that reminds you to actually do the habit? You know, what is it that puts it in your brain? And it's worth it to mention that habits can have multiple cues, particularly if they're habits that you engage in several times a day. For instance, I mentioned the thing with the cup of tea earlier on, and it might be that that's the case for you, that you get all these reminders throughout the day to engage in a habit. So yeah, it's worth it to bear that in mind. There can be more than one cue. So what craving is there, you know, and what is the reward? What's the outcome of engaging in that habit? So just take a wee moment to think of that. Now, why is this information important? You know, what's the relevance of it all? So as I mentioned, we can sort of use this information in order to, I guess, manipulate situations or manipulate our surroundings in a sense, so that we can create more favourable conditions for acting out a particular habit, or more favourable conditions for not acting out a particular habit if it's something that we're trying to stop. And many of us already do this to some extent without ever really sort of being conscious of it, and I'll mention that a little bit more later. It can also better help us understand why we engage in some of the habits, particularly the ones that we dislike. You know, so if you've got any habits that within yourself or even in people around you, sometimes it can be easy to be really, you know, sort of critical of ourselves or of other people's for doing things that we dislike. And so if we understand that process a bit more, I think a sense of compassion naturally arises from that. So I'm going to look first at what it means to, like how you can manipulate this information in order to help create a new habit. Now I just want to mention that I've highlighted two boxes here, particularly the cue one and the response one. I've highlighted them because I'd say that they're the easiest to manipulate in a sense, due to their nature. The other two, craving and reward, refer to, I guess, a sense of an internal experience. So craving is very much about desire and motivation. And as I mentioned before, reward is very much about that chemical reward, the neurochemical reward. And so they're a bit harder to manipulate. Not impossible, but certainly a bit more difficult. And I'll talk more about that shortly. So what do we want to do if we're trying to sort of install a new habit into our lives? Well, with the cue, we want to make it obvious. And, you know, we need a reminder to actually do the habit. And with modern technology, this is actually fairly easy. You know, we can set reminders on our phone for anything. We can set them at any time of the day. You can even, there's apps where you can set a reminder that's based on location. So if you say you arrive at the the supermarket that you typically go to, you can set your phone so that it sends you a reminder when you arrive, saying, you know, buy whatever, buy milk, or whatever it is that you need. So it's fairly easy nowadays to be able to set reminders for ourselves. There are also other ways of doing it. So for instance, if you wanted to start doing yoga, you can leave your yoga mat out in a place that's quite visible. You know, so objects and things like that can become a cue. There's also a concept that's sort of worth mentioning here, which is called habit stacking. Now, what habit stacking is when you take an existing habit that you've already got in your life, and then you sort of tack a new habit onto the end of that. And so therefore the cue for the new habit becomes the end of the old habit. So this is, you know, for instance, when people, we already have these sort of stacks of habits. So when you brush your teeth, then you floss, and then you use mouthwash, or, you know, these kind of things. Maybe, you know, you'll have habits in terms of how you make tea, etc. So these things already exist in our lives. And so you might decide that you're going to do, for instance, your physiotherapy exercises right after you get dressed in the morning, whatever it is. So that's step one, reminding yourself to actually do the habit. Craving, as I mentioned, this is a bit more complex, but it's ultimately about trying to make that process, make the habit as desirable as possible, or as I've put in brackets here, make not doing it very undesirable. So, for instance, going back to the point about yoga, are there ways that we can make the habit seem more desirable? Can we do it in a nice environment with someone that we like? Can we do it with, you know, maybe it's candles and incense and music that you put on? Something that's going to make that a more desirable environment for you, a more desirable situation. If you're going to start jogging, for instance, do you want to jog through industrial estates, or would you like to go up to Holyrood Park and go for a, you know, a nice jog in that environment? So there's a sense of trying to make sure that that there's something ultimately desirable about engaging in that habit. That aside, as I mentioned, craving is very much about motivation and desire, and, you know, they're still doing a lot of research on those things, but they're much harder to manipulate in the same way that physical environments are. So the third part is the response, the actual habit itself. And the key here really is just to make this as easy as possible. We want to put up as few barriers as possible to engaging in the task. And we want to take out as much of the thinking as we possibly can when we do the tasks. So again, if we're talking about going for a run, it might be that you have your route planned out and you know when you're going to do it, and you have all your clothes set out for when you're going to do it. The last thing you really want to be doing, because if you're anything like me, which is to say bone idle, you would just choose, you know, you would sort of take any opportunity you could to say, oh, well, maybe I'll do it tomorrow instead. So you want to take as much of the thinking and the sort of minute complications out of it as possible. It's also worth mentioning in this part of making something easier, I guess, is also about coming up with contingency plans, or at least recognizing some of the barriers that might come up, and sort of setting yourself a plan B in the event that those things do come up. So again, with running, what are you going to do instead if you wake up and it's pouring down outside and blowing a gale? You might choose to do something else at home. So you want to think about some of the eventualities that are going to get in your, you know, the eventual barriers that might jump in your way, and come up with plans for dealing with that. And then the last one I've got here, reward. Ultimately, we're looking to make it satisfying, or as I've mentioned in brackets, make not doing it sort of very unsatisfying. Now, as I mentioned, this has a lot to do with the reward systems in the brain and the release of dopamine, which is much more complex. But there are some ways to make things more rewarding. And one of the big things that comes to mind here as sort of accountability partners or being accountable to other people. I know accountability buddies is a sort of growing concept where people will maybe work out together, or at least they'll keep each other updated on what's happening with their work, and or with their exercise or their diet or whatever it is. I think that's the kind of one of the core principles, I guess, of things like I don't know what's the diet thing again? I can't remember what the name of it is, but when everyone goes and they get weighed together and they need to follow a certain diet. I think you know what I mean. So I just can't remember the name of it at the moment. So other things as well there, I suppose, might be about posting on social media, although I don't know if anybody needs any more like diet photos on social media. I don't know if anyone likes that, but you know, it might be that you've got a group of people on there who are quite supportive and who'll sort of encourage you. And so this one, to break an old habit, it's just inverting those rules. So with the cue, we want to make it hidden. And this can be quite difficult, particularly where a habit has many cues. For instance, as I mentioned with tea, you know, with people drinking tea, or it might be if you're a smoker, there are loads of things that remind you that you to have a cigarette. So it can be difficult and to try and sort of cover them all, but it is certainly beneficial at least to sort of get rid of some of them, or to recognize at least that they're there and that they're going to be cues for you. The second part there is craving. So again, just inverting it, make it undesirable, or make not doing it very desirable. Again, quite difficult. You know, is there any way really to make eating chocolate seem undesirable? I'm not sure, I don't think so. If you find out, let me know. But the response, so this third part, is about making it difficult and putting as many barriers and many obstacles in the way to actually doing the activity or doing the habit as possible. So we already do this in some sense. For instance, if you've ever been at the supermarket and the ideas come to you that, okay, maybe I'll buy that bar of chocolate, or maybe I'll buy that giant packet of crisps. And then you've thought, nah, do you know, if I buy this, I'm just going to eat it, as if there's anything else to do with food. But that's effectively what we're doing in that sense, is we're recognizing that later in the evening, maybe when we have that craving for chocolate, we're probably going to be too lazy to get up and to get, you know, ready and go to the shop just for the purpose of buying it. So that's us effectively putting a barrier in our way to engaging with that habit. And we do this in a whole host of things. And the last one there is the reward. So making it as unsatisfying as possible, or make not doing it very satisfying. And again, there's that thing about accountability partners and what happens when you have to say to the people at, you know, your group that you haven't lost weight, or whatever it is that you're attempting to do. And one last, this is a kind of sits beside all that stuff, is this idea of habit substitution. So this is where the anatomy of the habit more or less stays the same, but we substitute in a bit something healthier into the routine. So where the cue, the craving is all the same, but then it's the response maybe that's slightly different. And we already, again, we do this in numerous ways. So it might be that if you are wanting to cut down on how much tea or coffee that you drink, you make a choice to switch to herbal tea, or to water in with lemon in it. You know, something that for you is acceptable, that response is acceptable, or at least certainly healthier or more helpful than the one before. And we do this with, you know, people with e-cigarettes. I've done that for legal cigarettes. Perhaps if you're trying to eat less meat, you might switch in a meat-free burger for a regular one. Maybe you have fruit lying around for snacking rather than having chocolate or biscuits. So these are all ways to go about doing that, to substitute one habit for another. And again, they can be, quite often you can see sort of in education, people do this for kids where maybe if they have a response to anger that's unhelpful or not particularly a healthy response, people can try and suggest for children different ways that they can go about dealing with their anger. And so that's, in a sense, quite a similar process. And one last part on that, this concept of mindfulness. I know the whole concept of mindfulness is very much in vogue at the moment, and everyone's talking about it, and people are probably sort of tired of hearing about it, but there's a growing body of research that mindfulness and meditation have incredibly positive effects on our overall well-being. And ultimately at this point, talking about mental health without mentioning mindfulness would be a bit like talking about physical fitness without mentioning exercise. You know, it's very much related to our mental health. For anyone who has not heard of mindfulness is, as I've mentioned there, simply paying attention. It's noticing things without judging it, without criticizing it, without thinking of how it should be better, and without attempting to change things. So you're just accepting things as they are, without necessarily trying to sort of get in there and fix things or to make it different. And so why is this useful? Well, it helps us ultimately to recognize what's happening around us and within us. So we recognize, for instance, the cue for a habit, and we recognize the craving that we get inside us, the compulsion that we feel in order to sort of engage with that habit, because we're more attuned to the stimulus, and we're more attuned to our own thoughts and our emotions and the physical sensations in our body, etc. So because we become more aware of that whole process, we then get to decide how we want to proceed with it, and we act less automatically. We act with less of a, we think a little bit about how we act. So as I mentioned there, mindfulness sort of helps us with the cue. It helps us recognize the cue. It helps us recognize the craving, that feeling that we get within ourselves. And now I've got a desire to do such and such. And this is where mindfulness, so those two things, I've left them white because mindfulness ultimately can't change those things. It can, we can't necessarily change that, a cup maybe reminds us that we want a cup of tea. But what we can do is mindfulness helps us put a bit of space in between a stimulus and a response. So it makes us just a bit less reactive in that sense. And we get this little, in that tiny, tiny bit of space, we can then say, okay, well, do I really want to have whatever it is, or should I try and take a different route? And that's a hugely, hugely important thing, recognizing that we have the choice and that we have the willpower to do these things. And then with the last part, reward, being mindful allows us the space effectively to sort of celebrate our own achievements and to see how well we've done, or at the very least to recognize how something makes us feel. So we know how we feel when we've eaten a nice healthy dinner compared to how it feels when we've just finished a Domino's pizza, for instance. It feels different in our body and it feels different in our head. And so mindfulness is about recognizing that process and sort of keep holding on to that information. And so I'm going to mention this just briefly, purely because I think it's a great example of just how powerful this process is. But I'm going to talk a bit about how marketing and businesses and advertising effectively get us to engage in habits which mean that we spend money on their product. And as I mentioned, it's one of the best examples I've got for how ingrained this system is and just how well that sort of anatomy of a habit works. And one of the things, so I looked this up just this morning, and I found out that in 2018, Coca-Cola spent almost $6 billion on global advertising. And you sort of have to wonder, you know, why is it worth at least $6 billion for Coca-Cola to do this? It's not because they need to get the word out, because hardly anybody knows what Coca-Cola is. We all know what Coca-Cola is. But the reason that they do so much of that is because it's beneficial for them to have these constant cues everywhere. They need to be constantly sort of reminding us that what we want is some Coca-Cola, and that what's going to make us feel fresh is Coca-Cola, and what's going to kill us dead. You know, this constant reminder. And it's the same with everyone, McDonald's, you know, these big companies, they're not trying to get the word out. It's not as though people don't know who they are, but it's beneficial for them to have these reminders. And so there's adverts everywhere you look. There's adverts on the TV and magazines, on news websites, on YouTube videos. Anywhere that people are going to be, there's now advertising. And it's beneficial for companies to give us that constant cue, that constant reminder to act out this habit. The next part there is craving, and there's so much of this. You know, it doesn't take much to look at adverts to see how they sort of link a product to a sense of status or a sense of beauty. You know, if you buy this product, you're going to look like Scarlett Johansson. There's a sense of luxury even, particularly with holidays and hotels and things like that. So there's always this, they're always trying to give you this, I guess this sense that your life is in some way going to be improved by this product. The response, so how do they make it easier for us to actually go about engaging in the habit? Well, you can buy things now on credit. You can buy loads of things without necessarily having the money to buy it. You get free delivery on things, or home delivery if it's for food. So, you know, you can now call a McDonald's. You don't even need to call. You don't even need to speak to someone. You can just do it on your phone, and someone will arrive at your door within sort of 25 minutes. Things like repeat orders. So when you go into, I think if you shop on websites like Tesco or Sainsbury's, I think you can quite often just click that you want to repeat your order, and that's it. You don't even need to shop in order to get your shopping. They can just do it for you. And so predictability of service is another one. So particularly where restaurants are concerned, or places like Starbucks, where you know when you go in, you know that you need to order this at this point, and then you move along the chain until you get your coffee, and there's the same products, etc., all the time. And then the last part, the reward, how is it that they effectively make it satisfying for us? Well, there's things about fast service and predictable service. We get these sort of shiny, sleek products. If anyone's, you know, bought a mobile phone, you'll know how sort of nice it is, that process of taking your phone out of the box for the first time. And then a lot of other things around sensory rewards. We get a sense of status, etc., etc. So, I mean, I'm not doing that section to make any kind of point in particular, other than just that this process is so sort of ingrained within us that it's profitable for companies like Coca-Cola or McDonald's to spend billions and billions and billions of pounds each year on advertising. So bear that in mind, I think, is just the message there. And so I think that's more or less me for the day. What we can do now is move on to question and answers, if that's all right.
Yeah, fab. Thank you so much, Stuart. I'm not going to take any offence because I feel a bit personally attacked about the marketing thing. I'm the worst person for like seeing a fad on TV and being like, I need that. And then what people know is random stuff arrives to the office and they're like, what have you ordered now? But thank you so much for that. So does anyone have any questions or comments or observations that they would like to share just now?
Hi, Stuart. I just wanted to say I thought your your thoughts around mindfulness were really interesting as well. And that's yet another, not use isn't the right word, but another thing that mindfulness can help with, especially when we're all feeling super stressed. And it might be quite useful for, before you hit that click to buy button, you could do a bit of mindfulness, and that might cut down your purchases by 50%.
Yeah.
You never know. Anyway, no, that was really, really useful actually, and lots of, again, practical tips and hints. And I did like the bit on mindfulness. That's especially good. Yeah.
Thanks,
put that
Lynn.
space in between. Yeah.
Yeah, as you say, it's you know, I guess companies have made it such a quick process for us now that you, like before, at one point, if you wanted to buy something, you had to go to the shop, and you know, like all this, it was just a stress. There was so much time to be able to say, well, do I really need this? Whereas now, effectively, I mean, if I decided that I wanted a giant beanbag, I could probably have one, you know, bought. I could have paid for one within the next 5 minutes. So yeah, having like mindfulness is really a hugely important thing in terms of being able to just put that bit of space, make something a response, not a reaction, and just sort of following up on that, I mentioned, you know, mindfulness is certainly becoming a much a hugely discussed topic. And I think at one point people thought there was a lot of sort of mysticism around mindfulness, and that there was kind of, that it was a bit wishy-washy maybe. But more and more they're doing a lot of research on mindfulness and meditation, and just finding that it has huge benefits on people's overall well-being. So yeah, thanks for...
Yeah, absolutely.
Does anyone else have any other questions or comments or observations that they want to share with everyone? No, I actually have one. So, Stuart, you mentioned briefly at the start to think about like other people's habits, and they are. What would you suggest in order to like support other people in either like making a habit or breaking a habit? So, I'm going to talk about like if they actually, so say like somebody smokes or something and they're maybe trying to stop. What can you do to help support someone with their habit formation?
Yeah, so I mean that's an excellent question, and I think it's a complex one in the sense of, you know, ultimately, particularly for instance, you mentioned smoking there, so I'll take that one. People who smoke, there's probably, when you look at those 4 steps, there's probably so many clues that people get for smoking, you know, that it's going to be impossible to erase particular clues. You know, it might be that people smoke when they're stressed. It might be that they smoke because it's morning. It might be that they smoke because they're having a coffee. So all of these cues are there, and it's a kind of all roads lead to Rome type thing where, you know, no matter what. But I think, and as well, there's also that, you know, obviously craving is a huge thing when it comes to things like cigarettes and alcohol and drugs, etc. I suppose ultimately would be about helping that person, one, recognize their own cues, you know, the things that make them, that remind them to engage in that habit, and then sort of finding ways that they can either avoid that cue if it's at all possible, or come up with sort of contingencies for what they can do when they encounter that cue. So a big one that I hear for people who smoke or who've stopped smoking is that they say, well, I couldn't go out with my friends anymore, or I couldn't go to the pub anymore. So these kind of things where people just feel that they need to just avoid it. And in particular, I would identify the sort of strongest ones. So again, for people who are smoking, that might be that drinking is a big sort of habit for them, or a big sort of cue for that habit. And already when you're drinking, you're, let's just say you're not at your most mindful when you're drinking. So, you know, your sense of reasoning and self-control, I suppose, in a sense, is diminished. So yeah, I would help someone to identify their own cues in that sense, and then finding other responses to it that can be helpful. So if someone is stressed, can we find a new way to deal with that stress that doesn't involve smoking a cigarette? If someone is, just does like having a cigarette with their coffee, is there some way that can be changed? It might be that they substitute in an e-cigarette for those times. Whether that's good or bad is not my place to say, but yeah, so that's a hugely complex one. And ultimately, if I had an easy answer for that, most people would have stopped smoking by now, if we had an easy answer. The one thing I would say is that it's great for, it helps for me anyway, and I've people in my life who smoke. It makes me understand how difficult it is for people to stop certain habits, particularly when they're very much ingrained in their life. So I think that might be one of the biggest things that it can help do.
And I've got something to add as well. Thank you. I've really enjoyed this. I've got so much out of it. Thanks. It's been excellent. And so methodically performed. Whatever. Anyway, but yeah, the mindfulness. I think that is a massive one in helping people to break habits. And alongside, I'm a hypnotherapist, and so I know an awful lot about mindfulness and hypnotherapy and mind-body techniques. Because in addition to the mindfulness, there's a little thing that I teach of, well, I've just had one. And so when people are wanting a cigarette or a drink or a biscuit or whatever, they can tell themselves they've just had one and use the mindfulness techniques that change the neuroplasticity of the brain. And then the body also holds memories. It's not just the mind. So there's different things that are mindful, that sort of thing is one of them that you can do that starts to reprogram your responses from the stress hormones that you are creating because you've got a craving for something or you've got a habit that you want to break. So that's also, in addition to the mindfulness, the mind-body techniques, which I think it's energy psychology, and it's becoming more and more to the fore, just as mindfulness, like 10, 12 years ago, people hadn't really heard of mindfulness, and now most people have heard of it. I think in another 10 years, these mind-body techniques, where you're using the body as a barometer to help you to help yourself, will also be very current. And then, of course, as a hypnotherapist, if all else fails, you can have hypnotism. So I just wanted to add that in because not that part, but the other stuff that I'm saying, that there's so many little self-help techniques that you can source that will help you to reprogram your responses to the cues that we get often. And one major one is, I've just had one. I've just had a drink. I've just had a ciggy. Thank you. I've really got a lot out of this.
That's really interesting, Gillian. Thanks for mentioning that. Do you know, as you say that as well, this is, I'm reminded of something. So my mother used to smoke, and she went to a smoking cessation thing run by the NHS. And they provided, I think there's a pill that people can take prior to quitting smoking, and I think it's called Champix, but don't quote me on that. And it's really interesting to see what this does to that whole system. I mean, I don't know the neuroscience behind how it works, but effectively it makes smoking a cigarette not a pleasurable experience for smokers, and they don't get that same sense of reward. And then as a result, their craving sort of starts to diminish. And so that's a really interesting way that people can manipulate those two other parts, that craving and the reward part, sort of chemically. I mean, it's whether, I'm not saying that I would recommend using it. I don't know I've never.
You can get something similar for alcohol, so that the dopamine that's response, the pill gives them it, so they've got it, so they don't need the alcohol because they're feeling that way. So I presume it's something similar with the cigarettes. Yeah,
and now that you mentioned that, Gillian, with alcohol, I think there's also, not to be too graphic, but I think people can also take a pill which effectively makes them vomit if they drink alcohol. And so there you go, that's again this whole manipulation of that process, where that's not a particularly rewarding. In fact, it's almost the opposite. It's quite it's a huge deterrent for people. So those are some really interesting ways that reward system and that craving is manipulated chemically.
Wow, that's fascinating, fascinating.
Yeah.
One that comes to mind for me, it's a lot more tame, but my sister, when she was younger, always used to bite her nails. My mum bought this nail varnish stuff.
Yeah.
It used to taste disgusting when you bit your nails, so it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of it. It becomes deeply unpleasant. Yeah, exactly.
So thank you everyone for joining today's session. I hope you found it very useful. And thank you so much for Stuart for organising all these sessions, as well as doing 2 of them for us. It's really appreciated. As I said, this video, along with all the other ones in the mental health series, is available on our YouTube channel, so please do check it out. And if you have any questions, please do let myself or Stuart know. Thank you again for coming along. Take care and hopefully see you all again soon.